He stands at the front of the line. The shield is braced against his shoulder, its rim level with his eyes, and through the narrow gap above it, he can see the field ahead. 40 paces of open ground, maybe less. The grass is wet and trampled where the Danish line has been forming, and the men across from him are close enough now that he can make out the grain of their shields. The pale rings of limewood, the dull iron of the bosses. They're not charging yet, but they are moving. The whole line shifts and tightens. The sound of it carries across the gap. The knock of shields pressed together, the low murmur of voices he cannot understand. His mouth is dry, his legs feel loose beneath him, as though the ground is not quite solid, and the spear in his right hand is slick with sweat. He adjusts his grip. He has done this before. He knows what is coming. He knows what the first impact feels like when a shield wall meets another at pace. The way it drives through the arm and into the chest. The way the world compresses into a space no wider than his own shoulders. The man to his left is breathing hard. A rapid, shallow sound that does not stop. The man to his right has not moved at all. He stands with his weight forward and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on the line ahead. Neither of them speak. There is nothing to say. They've been called from their land and told to stand here, on a hillside in Wiltshire, on ground they may have never seen before, and hold. He does not know the shape of the battle. He does not know how wide the line stretches or how many ranks stand behind him, or what is happening on the flanks. He does not know whether the men on the far left have already made contact. He does not know the name of the Danish leader who commands the army across the field, though he has heard it spoken. He knows only that the distance is closing, the noise is growing, that the Danish line is beginning to move with a new kind of purpose. The shields rising, the pace quickening, the mass of it gathering into something that is no longer standing still. The ground shakes before the sound reaches him, a low, rolling vibration that comes up through his feet and into his knees. Then, the sound itself. Not a roar, not yet, but a deep, percussive rhythm, hundreds of feet striking wet earth at something close to a run. The Danish line surges forward. He braces, plants his back foot, feels the man behind him press a hand against his spine. The shield comes up tight to his jaw. He cannot see properly now. Only the tops of the approaching shields, rising and falling with the rhythm of the charge, and beyond them, the pale sky of an English spring. Then, the collision. It hits like nothing the body can prepare for. The full weight of a running man driven through limewood and iron into his chest. His feet slide, his neck snaps forward. The air leaves him in a single forced breath and the world becomes noise, a deafening, splintering crack as the two walls meet along the length of the line. And then the grinding pressure of bodies locked together at close quarters. His shield is pinned against him. He cannot swing, he cannot step back. Somewhere to his right a man is screaming, a high, animal sound that cuts through the roar and then stops. A spear point scrapes against the face of his shield and then catches on the rim. He twists it away, but there is no room to strike back. There is only the weight, the heat, the smell of sweat and iron and wet wool and turned earth. The heaving, suffocating press of the shield wall, locked tight, going nowhere. This is Edington, May 878, and the battle fought on this hillside will decide the fate of the last remaining English kingdom. But the battle itself is not the story. What matters is what comes after, what one king chooses to do with his victory. Because the peace that follows this fight will not unite England, it will divide it. The eastern half of the country will become something different from the west. It will become a place where Danish custom holds and Danish law applies. It will become the Danelaw. So how did one battle lead to the division of a country? Why did a victorious king choose peace over destruction? And what does it mean when the land a man fights to save has already become something he no longer recognises? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the story of how Alfred the Great defeated the Vikings and the line that divided England. Long before the shield wars met at Edington, England had already begun to come apart. The process was slow at first. For most of the 8th century, the island's coastlines had been quiet. The kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons faced inward, competing with each other for land and influence. their borders shifting through marriage and war and the slow accumulation of local power. The sea was not a boundary, not a threat. Then, in the last decade of the century, that changed. Small fleets appeared off the coast of Dorset, off Lindisfarne, off the monastery islands of the north. The ships were fast and shallow drafted, built to beach on open shore, and the men who came ashore moved quickly. They struck monasteries and coastal settlements, took what they could carry, and were gone before any organised response could form. The written accounts of these early raids carry a blunt, startled quality. There is no framework for understanding them. They are simply events. Ships appear, men die, treasure vanishes. They read like the words of people encountering something they have no precedent for, and no ready means to prevent. For decades, the pattern held. The raiders came for portable wealth, and when they had it, they sailed home. What changed, gradually then unmistakably, was the nature of the ambition behind the crossings. By the middle of the 9th century, the Scandinavian presence in England had begun to shift from seasonal plunder to something more sustained. In the winter of 850 to 851, a Danish force overwintered on the Isle of Thanet for the first time rather than returning across the North Sea. It's a small detail, easy to pass over, but it marks a fundamental change in intent. Men who stay through winter are not raiding, they are occupying. They need food, shelter, and some form of relationship with the land around them, whether through trade or intimidation or alliance. They're putting down roots, however shallow. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 made the new reality impossible to ignore. This was not a raiding party. It was a military force of significant size, organised for sustained campaigning and led by commanders with clear strategic objectives. Ivar and Halfdan were among its leaders, though the internal command structure of the army remains difficult to reconstruct with certainty. What is clear is that this force did not intend to plunder and leave, it intended to conquer. And the speed in which it moved through the English kingdoms exposed how brittle those kingdoms had become. East Anglia was the first to fall. The army landed there in the autumn of 865, and the East Anglian king, rather than fight, negotiated. He provided horses and supplies, perhaps calculating that cooperation was far safer than resistance. It was a reasonable decision under pressure, and it was also a fatal one. The Danes used East Anglia as a base, rested through winter, and then rode north in force. Northumbria was torn apart within months. The kingdom had been fighting a civil war of its own, two rival kings competing for a throne that neither could hold securely. When the Danish army arrived at York in November 866, it found a divided kingdom and a poorly garrisoned city. York fell with little resistance. The following spring, the two Northumbrian kings managed to set aside their rivalry long enough to launch a joint counterattack. They broke through the city's old Roman walls and fought their way into the streets. It was not enough. Both kings were killed in the fighting, and with them died any realistic prospect of Northumbrian independence. The Danes installed a client ruler, a local man who would govern in their interest, and moved on. Mercia was larger, wealthier, and better organised than Northumbria, and it resisted longer. Within living memory, it had been the dominant kingdom in England. Under Offa, in the late 8th century, it had projected power across the island, built the Great Dyke along the Welsh border, and treated other English kingdoms as subordinates. But Offa's achievements had not survived his dynasty. By the 860s, Mercia was powerful in name, but weakened in substance. Its kings struggling to maintain authority over a nobility that owed them less loyalty with each passing generation. The Danish army entered Mercia in 867, and over the following years made it a theatre of repeated occupation. Nottingham was taken. The Mercian king, Burgred, appealed to Wessex for help, and the West Saxons came. But the combined English force achieved nothing decisive. The Danes withdrew on their own terms, moved elsewhere, and returned when it suited them. Burgred fought and negotiated and paid tribute, cycling through the same inadequate responses for nearly a decade. By 874, he had exhausted his options. He abandoned his kingdom and left for Rome. where he would die in exile. The Danes replaced him with Ceolwulf, dismissed by his own countrymen as a foolish king's thane. Ceolwulf held the title, but the Danes held power. Mercia was finished as an independent force. 3 kingdoms gone in less than 10 years, not burned to the ground, not emptied of their populations, but stripped of their independence and restructured to serve Scandinavian interests. The men at the top were different now, and the logic of power had changed. Land that had been held by English lords was being redistributed to Danish warriors. Place names were beginning to shift, customs were beginning to diverge. The transformation was quiet, but it was already underway long before anyone drew a line on a map and called it the Danelaw. By the mid-870s, only Wessex remained independent, and Wessex was led by a man who had never been meant to rule. Alfred was the 5th son of King Ethelwulf. 4 brothers stood between him and the throne, and for the first decades of his life, there was no reason to think any of them would fail to produce heirs of their own. But they died, one after another, through battle and illness and the ordinary cruelties of 9th century life. The line shortened until Alfred was the last one standing. He became king in 871, at the age of roughly 22, in the middle of a year of almost continuous fighting. 9 major engagements were fought between the West Saxons and the Danes that year. Alfred won some, lost others, and by the end of it, had purchased a fragile peace with silver. It bought him time, but not much. He used it carefully. The years between 871 and 878 were not peaceful, but they were less catastrophic than what had come before. Alfred strengthened what he could. He maintained what connections he could with the Mercian nobility, whose own kingdom had been hollowed out by Danish occupation. He watched the Danes consolidate their hold on the north and the east. He prepared, knowing that confrontation was not finished, but merely postponed. Guthrum was the man who would force it to a conclusion. His early career is largely invisible to us, but by the mid-870s he had risen to command the southern Danish army, and his focus was Wessex. Unlike some earlier Scandinavian leaders who had been content to extract tribute and install puppet rulers, Guthrum seems to have understood that Wessex would not submit to half measures. It would have to be taken whole, its king removed, its structures replaced. He had watched the method work in Northumbrian Mercia. He intended to apply it one more time. The confrontation between Alfred and Guthrum played out over several years in a pattern of advances, truces, and betrayals. In 876, Guthrum led his army deep into Wessex and occupied the fortified town of Wareham on the Dorset coast. Alfred moved to contain him, and a standoff followed. Hostages were exchanged, oaths were sworn on sacred relics. Then Guthrum broke them, moving his army west to Exeter in a sudden night march that left Alfred wrong-footed and furious. Another truce was negotiated, this time apparently in better faith. Guthrum withdrew from Wessex and moved to Gloucester to overwinter. Then came Chippenham. In early January 878, during the feast of Twelfth Night, Guthrum struck. The timing was precise and brutal. The West Saxon court was gathered at the royal estate of Chippenham for the first Christmas season, a time of feasting and ceremony when the kingdom's guard was at its lowest. Guthrum's army moved fast, covering the distance from Gloucester before any warning could arrive. Chippenham fell. Much of the West Saxon population submitted to Guthrum in the aftermath. Others fled across the sea. Alfred's kingdom did not merely lose a battle, it lost the ability to function. The royal estate that had served as a centre of governance was now a Danish stronghold. The network of obligation and loyalty that held Wessex together depended on the king being visible, accessible, and capable of rewarding those who served him. With the courts scattered and the treasury seized, that network unravelled. Thanes who had sworn oaths to Alfred now faced a simple calculation: resist and lose everything, or submit to Guthrum and keep their land. Many chose submission. It was not cowardice, it was survival, and Guthrum understood this. He was not merely occupying territory, he was dismantling a kingdom from the inside, replacing one set of loyalties with another, just as the Danes had done in Northumbria and Mercia before. Alfred fled south and west into the Somerset levels, the low-lying marshland around the River Parrett, where the ground turned to bog and the waterways made pursuit nearly impossible for an army that did not know the terrain. He retreated to Athelney, a patch of raised ground surrounded by wetland, barely large enough to support a small camp. In winter and early spring the levels flooded, the rivers overflowed, and the land between them became a maze of shallow water, reed beds, and sodden ground that could swallow a man to the knee. For anyone without local knowledge, it was impassable. For Alfred, it was the only ground left. Later tradition would embroider this period with legends of burned cakes and disguised wanderings. But the strategic reality was plain. Alfred was a king without a functioning kingdom. His treasury was gone, his army was dispersed. The men who had sworn to follow him were scattered across the countryside, some hiding, some submitting to Guthrum, some simply trying to survive the winter. He held a few acres of marshland and the loyalty of those who had fled with him. It was not much to build a kingdom on. Yet something held. The loyalty of the western shires did not completely collapse. Ealdormen in Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire maintained their networks. Messages moved through the marshes. Small raids were launched against Danish positions, keeping Guthrum's forces unsettled and preventing total consolidation. Alfred was diminished but not destroyed, and through the early months of 878 he began, carefully and quietly, to rebuild. In early May he sent out the call. The meeting point was Egbert Stone, on the eastern edge of Selwood Forest, a landmark that the men of the western shires would have known. It was a deliberate choice. Selwood had a natural boundary, a thick belt of woodland that separated the western shires from the territory Guthrum now controlled. The men of Somerset, Wiltshire and part of Hampshire came to him there. They were glad to see him. These men had spent months in uncertainty, not knowing whether their king was alive or dead, hearing only rumours carried through the marshes and along the old trackways. Some of them had submitted to Guthrum and then changed their minds. Some had held out from the beginning. All of them had made the choice to come, and in making it had staked their lives and their families and their land on Alfred's ability to win. From Egbert Stone, Alfred marched his reassembled army north and east, camping overnight at Iley Oak before advancing to the high ground near Edington. Guthrum moved to meet them, and on that hillside, in the late spring of 878, the two forces came together. The stakes were absolute and both men understood them. If Guthrum won, Wessex would be absorbed as Northumbria and East Anglia and Mercia had been absorbed before it. There would be no more independent English kingdoms. The island would belong, in whole or in part, to Scandinavian rulers who would reshape it according to their own interests and customs. If Alfred won, the last English kingdom would survive. But even victory could not undo what had already happened. The north was Danish, the east was Danish, the Midlands were Danish in all but name. The England that had existed before the great heathen army crossed the sea was already gone. Whatever emerged from this battle would be something new. The only question was what form it would take. The battle itself, for all its significance, survives only as an outcome. The West Saxons advanced in close formation. The fighting was sustained and violent. And at some point, after what may have been hours of grinding attrition in the shield wall, the Danish line broke. It did not break cleanly. Shield wall engagements rarely ended in sudden collapse. What happened more often was a slow disintegration. Men at the edges of the line began to pull away. Gaps opened that could not be filled. The pressure from the opposing wall became uneven, concentrated on those still holding, and the instinct to survive overwhelmed the discipline to stand. Once that process began, it was almost impossible to reverse. The line did not retreat, it came apart. The Danes fled toward Chippenham, the royal estate they had held since January. Alfred pursued. a broken army that is allowed to regroup becomes an army again. The West Saxons followed the retreating Danes across the Wiltshire countryside, killing those they caught, seizing horses and supplies left behind in the rout, pressing the advantage as hard as their own exhaustion allowed. By the time Guthrum reached Chippenham and barred the gates, his army was diminished, demoralised and trapped. Alfred laid siege. Chippenham was a defensible site, but it was not provisioned for a long blockade. Guthrum's army had been living off the land for months, and the surrounding countryside had already been stripped thin from their own foraging. Whatever stores remained inside the estate would not last long with an army to feed. The Danes had no line of supply, no prospect of reinforcement from the north or east, and no realistic means of breaking out against a force that now held the initiative and the high spirits that come with a victory. They could fight their way out and risk destruction in the open, or they could wait and hope that Alfred's army would tire and disperse. For 14 days, they chose to wait. Inside the walls, the situation deteriorated steadily. An army that has just been routed does not recover quickly. The men who had fled from Edington were not simply tired, they were shaken. The shield wall had held for hours and then it had failed, and the retreat that followed had been chaotic and bloody. Some of the men inside Chippenham would have been wounded in battle or the pursuit. Others had been separated from their units and had made it back alone, without weapons or shields. Morale, the invisible force that holds an army together more reliably than any oath, was gone. These men had followed Guthrum because he won. Now he had lost, and the walls of Chippenham, which had seemed like the seat of a conquered kingdom only weeks earlier, had become a trap. It was during these 14 days that something shifted, not on the battlefield, but in the calculation of what came next. Alfred had Guthrum trapped. He had the military advantage. He had every justification by the standards of his time to press siege until the Danes were destroyed or forced into unconditional surrender. A dead Guthrum would have removed the most dangerous Danish leader in southern England. It would have been a decisive, uncomplicated victory. Alfred chose otherwise. What he demanded was without clear precedent. Guthrum was to submit, give hostages and accept Christian baptism, not as a humiliation, but as a transformation. Baptism would bind Guthrum to the Christian order that Alfred represented, grounding the peace in something deeper than a treaty and harder to break than an oath sworn on relics. The days that followed carried a weight that the battle itself could not match. What took place between the siege of Chippenham and the final feast at Wedmore was not simply a negotiation, it was a sequence of carefully staged acts, each one shaping the terms on which two peoples could coexist. And for the men who lived through it, the experience was unlike anything the wars had prepared them for. He rides out of Chippenham on a grey morning, with the mud still on his boots and the smell of siege still in his clothes. He is one of 30. Guthrum has chosen them to accompany him south, to a place called Alla, where the terms of the surrender are to be fulfilled. They ride in a loose column with a West Saxon escort on either side. No one has taken their weapons, but the escort makes the meaning clear. They are not guests, they are not prisoners, they are something in between, and no one has a word for it. The road takes them through country they held only weeks ago. He recognises some of it. A crossroads where they camped in February. A farmstead where they took grain. The buildings are still standing. But the people who come to their doors to watch the column pass do not look at the Danes the way they looked at them before. There is no fear in their faces now. There is something harder. A quiet satisfaction. The kind of look men give to a dog that has been brought to heel. They ride for most of the day. The land changes as they move south and west. The chalk downland gives way to lower ground, the fields becoming wetter, the sky widening as the hills fall behind them. By late afternoon, they are in the levels, and the ground beneath the horses is soft and uncertain. The hooves sink and pull free with a wet, sucking sound that sets a slow, heavy rhythm for the column. Water stands in the ditches. The tracks are narrow, hemmed in by reed beds that rise higher than a man on horseback. The dry stems clicking and scraping against saddle leather as they pass. The air is thick and warm and smells of peat and decay. This is not country he knows. This is not country any of them know. But the West Saxon riders move through it easily, following paths that are invisible until they are underfoot. This is where Alfred hid when Guthrum held Chippenham. This is the ground that kept the Saxon king alive. Riding through it now, surrounded by men who know every ditch and crossing, he understands why no one found him. They come to Aller as the light begins to fall. It's a small place, a handful of buildings on a low rise above the marshland. A timber church, a scatter of dwellings with smoke rising from their roof holes. He knows what is supposed to happen here. Word has passed among the 30. Guthrum is to accept the Christian rite. He is to take their water and their god and a new name, and in exchange the army goes east with its weapons and its life. It's the price of peace. Whether Guthrum believes any of it is a question none of them have been foolish enough to ask. They dismount at the edge of the settlement. The horses are led away and the 30 men stand in a loose group on the wet grass, waiting. A West Saxon thane approaches and speaks to Guthrum through an interpreter. Weapons are to be left outside the church. He unbuckles his sword and lays it on the ground. The others do the same. The pile grows. Swords and axes, the sound of iron on iron, blade against scabbard, belt fittings clinking as they are set down. One by one the 30 men disarm, and the small heap of steel on the grass beside the church says more about what is happening than any word spoken at Chippenham. Without armour, the 30 look thinner than they should. The siege wore them down, and the armour has been hiding it. Now, standing in wool and linen on a Somerset hillside, they look like what they are. Tired men a long way from home. The church is small. He has been inside Saxon churches before, but always after the fighting, when the contents are being stripped and the space was just another building to be searched. This is different. He ducks through the low doorway and the world changes. The sounds of the settlement fall away. The air inside is cool and close and smells of damp stone and tallow. His footsteps on the beaten earth floor are suddenly distinct, audible in a way they were not outside. Light falls in pale shafts through narrow openings in the walls. At the far end, a stone basin stands on a low plinth, filled with water. The Saxon king is already there. Alfred stands near the font with a handful of his own men, priests among them, dressed in robes that mark them as something other than warriors. The space is crowded, but quiet. The walls press in. There is no room for display here. Whatever is about to happen is meant to be witnessed, not admired. Guthrum steps forward. He walks to the front and the priests close around him. Words are spoken in the ritual language of the Christian faith, a low, rhythmic murmur that fills the small church and seems to press against the timber walls and the low ceiling, and the bodies of the men packed into the room. He's heard this kind of chanting before, drifting from churches his army passed on the march. He has never stood inside the sound of it. Guthrum kneels. He has followed Guthrum for years. He has watched him stand in front of shield walls and not flinch. He has watched him break oaths and make new ones and break those too. And through it all, Guthrum has carried himself like a man who answers to no one but his own judgment. And now he kneels, in a Saxon church, before a Saxon god, with water poured over his head by a Saxon priest while the Saxon king watches. This is what defeat looks like when it is dressed in ceremony. This is what it costs to keep an army alive. The water runs down Guthrum's face and neck and darkens the cloth at his shoulders. The church is silent except for the murmuring of the priests and the soft drip of water onto stone. None of the 30 move. They watch. Because watching is what they have come to do. And what they see is their leader being remade into something that belongs, at least in part, to the people who beat them. When Guthrum rises, the Saxons call him by a different name. Ethelstan. It is a Saxon name, heavy with the sounds that do not sit easily in a Danish mouth. He hears it spoken by the priests and by Alfred, and he understands the purpose of it, even if the word itself means nothing to him. A new name given by the victors, a claim made in sound. Whatever Guthrum was before he knelt, he carries something else now. Alfred steps forward and places his hand on Guthrum's head. The gesture is deliberate and slow, performed so that every man in the church can see it. He has been told this makes Alfred a kind of spiritual father to Guthrum in the Christian faith. He does not fully understand the concept, but he understands the image. One king standing, the other kneeling. A hand placed on a bowed head. The meaning needs no translation. They step back out into the evening air. After the close, still atmosphere of the church, the outside world feels wide and raw. The wind off the marshes carries the smell of water and reed. The light is fading. Their weapons still lie in the pile by the door, untouched, but no one moves to collect them. Not yet. Not until they are told. They are given white garments, all of them. He pulls his tunic over his head and drops it onto the grass. The air is cool against his skin. A Saxon hands him a white robe, clean and finely woven, and he pulls it down over his shoulders. The cloth settles against him, unfamiliar and light after weeks of wool stiffened with sweat and grime. Around him the others are doing the same. 30 men stripping off the last traces of the campaign and putting on what the Saxons had provided. Part of the ritual, he is told. The robes mark them as new to the faith, newly washed in the Christian water. They're supposed to mean rebirth. To the watching Saxons, he suspects they mean something closer to surrender. A few days later, the white garments were removed in a ceremony at Wedmore, a royal estate on higher ground above the levels. The chrism loosing, as the Saxons called it, marked the formal end of the baptismal period, and the setting matched the shift in tone. Where Allah had been intimate and hidden, Wedmore was public and political, a place of long views and open ground suited to the business of kings. The feast that followed lasted 12 days. Guthrum and his closest men were housed and fed at Alfred's expense, treated with the honour due to men of rank. It was generosity, but it was also a performance of power. Alfred could afford to be magnanimous. He could feed his enemy, clothe him in fine garments, and treat him as an equal at table. And in doing so, he made it clear who held the authority in the new arrangement. During those 12 days, the terms of the peace took their final shape. Guthrum would withdraw from Wessex. He would take his army east, into the lands the Danes already controlled, and rule there not as a raider, but as a baptized Christian king, governing territory that Alfred implicitly recognised as his to govern. The precise boundary would be formalised later. What mattered at Wedmore was the understanding. Wessex belonged to Alfred, the east belonged to Guthrum, and between them lay not a border enforced by armies, but a relationship defined by ritual, obligation, and a fragile mutual recognition. Neither man could be certain the other would honour it, but both needed it to hold. The peace was not generosity, it was necessity, dressed in the language of faith. Guthrum left Wedmore and returned to Chippenham. His army was allowed to leave with their weapons. That, too, was part of Alfred's calculation. An army permitted to withdraw in order was an army that might honour the peace. The following year, Guthrum moved east, first to Cirencester, where he spent the winter, and then into East Anglia, where he would settle and rule for the remaining years of his life. He took with him the men who had followed him through the years of war, and they took with them the expectation of land. They would need farms, they would need halls, they would need the structures of daily life that an army on the move does not require but a settled population demands. And to get them, they would reshape the land they now inhabited. Alfred watched him go. He had won the battle, he had won the peace, but the peace required him to accept something that no English king before him had accepted. That a large portion of what was once English territory was now, in practice, Danish. Not temporarily, not as an occupation waiting to be reversed, but as a settled reality, endorsed by agreement, governed by a man Alfred had personally raised from the baptismal water. The division of England was not something imposed by defeat, it was something chosen deliberately as the price of survival. No one declared the Danelaw. No king stood at a border and announced that the land beyond it was now a different country. There was no founding moment, no single act of division that separated east from west and made them two distinct things. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and in many ways more profound. The Danelaw came into being the way that most lasting changes do, through accumulation, through habit, through the steady weight of people living differently in the same land until the difference became the defining fact. It began with the simplest thing: men who had been soldiers becoming men who farmed. When Guthrum moved east into East Anglia in 879, he took with him an army that expected to be rewarded. These were not men who had crossed the sea for the pleasure of campaigning. They had fought for years, endured sieges, marched the length of England, and now the fighting was over. They wanted what soldiers always wanted at the end of a war: land, security, a place to settle and build a life that did not depend on the next raid or the next battle. And Guthrum, now styling himself Ethelstan on the coins he minted, needed to prove it. A leader who cannot reward his men does not remain a leader for long. The redistribution of land that followed was not orderly or systematic. It was improvised, uneven, and often brutal in its local effects. Danish warriors were granted estates that had belonged to English lords. In some places, this meant outright dispossession. In others, it meant subtler rearrangements, with Danish newcomers settling alongside English populations and gradually assuming control of the local power structures. The scale of the settlement varied enormously from region to region. In parts of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, the Danish presence was dense enough to reshape the land itself. In other areas, it was thinner, a scattering of new landholders among a population that remained largely English in speech and custom. But even where Danish presence was relatively sparse, the effect on governance was significant. The men who now held land in the east brought with them their own assumptions about how disputes should be settled, how property should be inherited, and how justice should be administered. Danish legal custom was not identical to English law, and where Danish lords held authority, Danish custom prevailed. The differences were not dramatic in every case, but they accumulated over time into something that amounted to a separate legal culture. The formal treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, drawn up at some point in the 880s, attempted to give this reality a defined shape. It established a boundary running roughly along the River Lee, then up north to Bedford along the River Ouse, then up Watling Street. It set out terms for trade, for the legal status of the men on either side. But the treaty did not create the division, it described one that already existed. The boundary it drew up was not a line imposed on an undifferentiated landscape. It was an acknowledgement of where, by that point, English custom ended and Danish custom began. The map followed the reality, not the other way round. And even then, the boundary was less like a border between two countries and more like a tide line, visible, meaningful, but never quite fixed. What made the Danelaw distinct was not just law or language or the origins of the ruling class. It was something more diffuse, a texture, a way of organising life that reflected the experience of settlement rather than inheritance. The place names told part of the story. Across the east and north, English suffixes that had named villages for generations began to give way to Scandinavian ones. Names ending in B and Thorpe and Thwaite spread across the landscape, each one marking a farmstead or a settlement established by men who spoke a different language. Whitby, Grimsby, Scunthorpe. These names were not imposed by decree. They grew naturally from the speech of the people who lived there, and over time, they became the only names those places had. The Old English names, if they ever had existed, were simply forgotten. The language itself began to diverge. In the Danelaw, Old English and Old Norse existed side by side, and the two tongues influenced each other in ways that would take centuries to fully work through. Everyday words crossed over. Legal terms were borrowed and adapted. The grammar of English in the East began to simplify, its speakers and the Scandinavian newcomers finding common ground by stripping away the inflections that made communication difficult. The England that emerged from this period did not speak one language. It spoke several variations of what would eventually become one. But in the 9th century, that convergence was still far away, and the differences were sharp enough to mark a man's origin the moment he opened his mouth. Guthrum died around 890, roughly a decade after the baptism at Alla. He was buried in East Anglia, in the kingdom he had governed since leaving Wessex. His coins bore the name Ethelstan. Whether he practiced the faith that he had accepted at the font is unknown. What is clear is that the territory he ruled did not revert to English control upon his death. Other Danish leaders succeeded him. The structures he had established continued to function. The land he had distributed remained in Danish hands. The settlement was not temporary. It had become permanent in the way that settlements do, not through any single decision, but through the slow accretion of lives lived in a particular place, children born, fields ploughed, customs observed until they became tradition. Alfred, for his part, spent the remaining years of his life strengthening what he still controlled. He did not attempt to reconquer the East. He may have hoped that his successors would, but in his lifetime, the division held. By the time Alfred died in 899, the shape of the thing was visible. Two Englands, side by side, each developing its own lines. The division would not last forever. Nothing does. But it lasted long enough to leave its mark on the language, the law, the land, and the names of 1,000 places that still carry the sound of the men who settled them. The Danelaw was never a country. It was never a kingdom in the way that Wessex, Northumbria, or Mercia had been. It was something harder to define, and for that reason, harder to undo. It was the shape that England took when two people agreed, reluctantly and imperfectly, to share the same island. And the line between them, drawn not in blood but in baptismal water, held for longer than either side might have expected. Well then, there you have it. If you've listened this far and like what you've heard, consider liking and subscribing. Also hit that notification bell to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, it helps so much, not only in pushing these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but also reassures me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.